I'd like to introduce you to Lesley Griffiths. And Lesley is involved in a voluntary role with the Welsh Government on an initiative to support community development around end-of-life care and also loneliness, isolation and dementia. She's going to be sharing her experiences of how the role of virtual technology, namely Zoom and Teams, has impacted upon herself and others during the pandemic. So over to you, Lesley.
Thanks, Jill. So I'm going to talk as quickly as I can and still make a bit of sense, I hope. 13 months ago, I was asked, as a result of some patient advocacy work I'd done for the Welsh Government on the End of Life Care Board, if I would chair their steering group for an initiative called Compassionate Cymru. Compassionate Cymru, as Jill said, is about raising awareness of dying, death, bereavement, and loneliness and isolation in communities, and getting communities working with them, alongside them, with them, rather than doing things to them, to support each other, to identify when someone is at the end of life and caring for someone at home or in a care home, or lonely and isolated, and encouraging neighbours and communities to feel confident enough to offer neighbourly, ordinary, common sense support. Obviously, not everyone's in a position to do that, but actually an awful lot of people can make the kind of contribution that makes a huge difference when you're in those situations. Ordinary things like walking the dog or dropping off a meal that's been cooked already can make a huge difference. Anyway, that's the aim and ambition of Compassionate Cymru. And as I said, I was asked to chair the group 13 months ago. When I asked what was involved, I was told it'll be 4 meetings for the year. We'll pay some travel expenses, but there's no actual budget. But it was a huge collaboration of third sector organisations, palliative care clinicians, representatives from the End of Life Care Board, social care and Welsh Government. The initial post that was in place had been funded by Macmillan, which is the cancer charity, and they were keen to stay involved. It sounded as if it wasn't too onerous, so I thought I'd give it a go. So I attended the first steering group meeting. It was in a church hall. It was a very confusing meeting. There were clearly cliques or loyalty groups who talked with each other before the meeting over cups of tea or coffee. And it was quite difficult working out who was who, but there were obviously status differences as well in that group. And then lockdown happened. And I thought, oh, that will really put a spanner in the works. But in fact, what happened was that after some really difficult issues with technology, our little steering group managed to adapt to using Zoom and Teams, including me. And we actually managed to start working much more smoothly than we would have if we'd continued to have to travel the distances to meet, set aside time for traveling, function in parking, travel, timetables, people's diaries. All of that suddenly got much easier. And because lots more people were dying in the community, it also went up the Welsh Government's agenda as something that they attached much more importance to, the role of informal volunteers. And although there was also pressure on volunteers in the community because many of them were shielding themselves or avoiding face-to-face contact, it worked out really well for us, trying to arrange multiple meetings right across Wales. And in fact, we even managed 2 consultation events, thanks to Diane and Jill in Bangor, who helped us to organise those consultation events with members of the community in North Wales, which would certainly have taken much longer and been much more difficult to arrange if we were going to do it face to face, which we would have done previously. So now we've arrived at a place where instead of 4 meetings a year, we're having 3 or 4 meetings for 4 or 5 days a week, which has brought with it its own exhausting consequences. So although we've been able to move that agenda forward a great deal, made huge numbers of connections with people, learned an awful lot, shared an awful lot, we're definitely beginning to feel the consequences of those kinds of meetings. Hardly any downtime on some days. We're trying to program in short one-to-one meetings for catch-ups, for gossip, for the sorts of social functions that give people a feeling that they're having a break. But I know as well that some of my colleagues in the small team that we work in are starting to suffer physical things, like I myself suffer from an eyesight deficiency that's become much worse because of using Zoom. And now we're starting to think about how we're going to move forward out of this. We want to keep the best of it, the reduction in travel expenses, travel time, having to get dressed up to go to a meeting when maybe you can do it with top half tidy, but the bottom half in pajamas, which greatly reduces pressure on people. Or whether, and we're having to think about, can we keep that? Is that going to work going forward? And it seems as if half of the people that we connect with and have been working with are very keen to keep it, and half feel no, they need the social contact, that a meeting provides a kind of social interaction they're not able to access without face-to-face contact. And we're also very keenly aware of the digitally excluded. It's a much higher number, I think, than the Welsh Government assumes. They've based some of their figures of a 10% gap, or 10% of the population over 16 being digitally excluded on the Wales National Survey. And in our experience, it's much, much higher, especially in some communities. And we're not reaching those communities online. We're just not. They require contact. They require the effort to go there, to talk to people, to show willing to be with people, to understand what goes on in communities that we're not all familiar with, and to work with them, alongside them. And we can't do that in the same way online, although we've been able to move it forward in a way that is very satisfactory for some of the top-down purposes of the project. We're really conscious that on the ground, we're not having the reach that we need to be equitable and not to reinforce those inequities that already exist. I've just got one more little point I want to make, which is a personal thing. I've enjoyed Zoom meetings and Teams meetings. I would have avoided them like the plague previously, because I hated that experience of having 1 or 2 people at a meeting on the screen at the end of the room or at the side of the room, and the meeting being conducted, but those people occasionally being asked, is there something you want to say? Definitely Zoom, Teams has leveled the playing field. Everyone's as remotely connected or as intimately connected as any other member in a meeting, provided they're carefully chaired, of course. But I experienced a family birthday call with 18 members of our extended family on the call. And it was such a shock to me to see the family dynamics played out in one plane on the screen. So you had the two grandmas competing for attention from the children, all sorts of conflicts and tensions that would have been physically spread out and not available to the single audience. It was such a shock to see the difference between a meeting and a social event like that, where normally you just wouldn't be conscious of all those dynamics going on. So I think it's a great research location. And that's it.